In the spring of 1953, as the Korean War dragged toward an uneasy armistice, the land bore the scars of 3 relentless years of fighting. Villages lay in ruins, bridges had collapsed into rivers, and the soil itself seemed exhausted from the weight of artillery. Yet amid that devastation, something unexpected began to take shape. In the southern provinces of Korea, where United Nations forces maintained rear positions, groups of American engineers from units, such as the 2nd Infantry Division and the 84th Engineer Battalion, turned their attention to a project that had nothing to do with fortifications or airstrips. They began building playgrounds for war orphans. At first, the sight was almost surreal. Heavy trucks that once hauled steel pontoon panels now carried planks of wood and salvaged metal pipes. Bulldozers that cleared minefields were used to level the ground near makeshift orphanages run by Korean civilians and missionaries. Where bunkers and ammunition depots had stood months earlier, the soldiers assembled swings, balance beams, and small climbing frames. Their tools were the same as on any construction site: hammers, welding torches, and ropes, but their goal had quietly shifted from survival to restoration. Photographs taken by Army correspondents documented these scenes with quiet astonishment. American soldiers in fatigue stood beside Korean children, guiding their hands as they painted rough wooden boards in white and blue. Some images later appeared in stars and stripes, accompanied by captions that described days of hope. The publication, which had chronicled the war's destruction for years, now captured a different kind of victory: the reappearance of normal life in a place that had forgotten what peace looked like. The timing of these gestures was significant. By early 1953, peace negotiations at Panmunjom were nearing completion, but the war's end remained uncertain. Thousands of displaced civilians and orphan children crowded into temporary camps and mission houses scattered from Kunsan to Taijon. For many of the engineers stationed nearby, the lull in large-scale combat brought an unusual sense of emptiness. Their tasks of building roads and repairing supply depots continued, but the men increasingly encountered groups of children wandering near the bases, drawn by the smell of field kitchens or the novelty of foreign uniforms. It was in those encounters that the engineers found a different kind of mission. They had spent months turning chaos into order, laying steel bridges across rivers, reinforcing airstrips under shell fire, but now they faced a quieter challenge: how to give back a small fragment of childhood to those who had lost it. The materials they used came from leftover military supplies: lumber from packing crates, cable wire from communication posts, even spare tires repurposed as swings. Nothing about these playgrounds was planned in official manuals. They emerged from human instinct rather than command structure. The first playgrounds appeared near orphanages like Friendship Home in Chongchonni, supported by the 2nd Infantry Division, and later near the newly established Zion Home in Kunsan. They were modest in scale, often built in a matter of days. Yet in a landscape defined by ruins, their presence carried a symbolic weight far beyond their size. Children who had spent their entire lives surrounded by the noise of artillery now ran, shouted, and laughed across the same ground that had been fought over. To witnesses, the sound seemed to mark not only the closing chapter of the war, but also the first fragile note of peace. For the soldiers, these brief projects became small sanctuaries within the machinery of war. They were reminders that engineering could serve more than destruction, that the same precision used to build a bridge could be used to build joy. On those days, under the pale Korean spring sky, the battlefield was momentarily transformed. The air carried not the echo of gunfire, but the rhythm of laughter, and for a fleeting moment, the engineers who had spent years building for war learned what it meant to build for life. By the spring of 1953, Korea was a land almost entirely consumed by absence. The war had torn through valleys and cities alike, leaving behind fields littered with shell casings and villages reduced to frames of burned timber. But beyond the physical ruins lay a deeper wound: the disappearance of an entire generation's childhood. The conflict had displaced an estimated 5 million people, and among them were tens of thousands of children who had lost their parents, homes, and any sense of belonging. Many wandered along the ruined roads or gathered near military camps, surviving on handouts or the charity of strangers. For them, the word home had ceased to have meaning. Throughout the southern part of the peninsula, improvised orphanages sprang up wherever there were roofs still standing. Some were organized by Korean teachers. others by church groups or Catholic and Protestant missionaries who had returned to aid the war's victims. By 1953, there were hundreds of such shelters, but almost none had steady funding or reliable supplies. The United Nations and the Republic of Korea government provided limited assistance, but the needs were overwhelming. Many orphanages existed on the edge of starvation, relying on whatever food and materials soldiers or relief organizations could spare. In towns like Pusan, Kunsan, and Taegu, children slept on straw mats, wrapped in discarded army blankets, their faces marked by hunger and frostbite. The American military presence brought both protection and contradiction. Soldiers were trained to build fortifications and supply depots, not to care for civilians, yet they encountered the consequences of war daily. Near bases and field hospitals, small groups of children appeared at dawn, waiting quietly for leftover rations or a chance to help carry water. Some gathered around burn trucks to scavenge bits of metal they could trade for food. To the engineers who saw them every morning, these children were reminders that even the most efficient logistics could not repair what war had truly broken. They represented a moral problem as much as a humanitarian one. Reports from that time, including dispatches in Stars and Stripes and U.S. Army correspondence, describe how quickly the number of orphans grew. By late 1952, estimates suggested more than 100,000 children were without parents, though the real figure was likely far higher. Relief organizations such as CARE, the American Korean Foundation, and the United Nations Civil Assistance Command UNCAC attempted to coordinate aid, but the resources were limited and the landscape of need was vast. Many orphanages were located near American or UN compounds, simply because proximity increased their chances of survival. Soldiers often gave away personal rations or helped patch leaking roofs during rest periods, small acts that blurred the line between combat duty and compassion. For the engineers in particular, the sight of children living among rubble struck a personal chord. Their work had always been about construction, bridges, runways, pipelines, but now they found themselves surrounded by destruction on a human scale. The tools that once symbolized precision and control seemed powerless against the chaos of civilian suffering. In those moments, the boundaries between soldier and citizen dissolved. The engineers were still under orders, still part of vast military apparatus. Yet in the presence of hungry, barefoot children, hierarchy lost its relevance. What remained was the simple recognition of need. Many soldiers later recalled how the orphans would watch from a distance as they worked, silent, motionless, eyes following every movement. The engineers understood that these children had grown up amid the rhythm of explosions and the drone of aircraft, sounds that had replaced lullabies. For them, play was a forgotten instinct. The challenge was not only to feed or shelter them, but to remind them that safety could exist. The absence of childhood itself had become the central tragedy of the war. It was this realization that began to transform the role of the American engineering units. They were surrounded by ruins, yet within those ruins were survivors whose lives depended not on weapons or supplies, but on gestures of humanity. Rebuilding a road could serve the army. Rebuilding a playground could serve the future. The engineers did not write this logic in their field manuals, but they lived it in practice. Each child who approached their camp was proof that the war's damage extended far beyond the front lines. And for the men who spent their days measuring steel and soil, that understanding was perhaps the most difficult calculation of all. By early 1953, the war in Korea had reached a strange equilibrium, a fragile standoff marked by negotiations at Panmunjom and by exhaustion on every front. The front lines had barely moved for months. Yet behind them, the landscape was in constant transformation. American engineering battalions, originally deployed to build bridges, airfields, and defensive positions, had quietly assumed a dual role, maintaining military infrastructure while also repairing the civilian world that the war had destroyed. Their equipment, bulldozers, graders, mobile workshops, became tools not only of war logistics, but of restoration. Throughout the southern and central regions of South Korea, engineers from the United States Army Corps of Engineers and the engineer battalions attached to combat divisions began taking on tasks that blurred the boundaries between combat and reconstruction. Roads carved for convoys became supply routes for humanitarian aid. Pontoon bridges originally designed for tanks were used to reconnect villages severed by bomb crossings. When combat intensity decreased, The same units that had constructed fortifications along the Naktong River were reassigned to rebuild schools, repair clinics, and clear debris from public squares. One of the earliest and most symbolic examples of this shift was the establishment of the Friendship Home Orphanage near Chongchonni in 1952. The project was supported by soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Division, whose headquarters operated in the region. Local Korean carpenters built the structure using salvaged timber, while American engineers provided nails, roofing material, and transport. The orphanage soon became a point of pride for the division. Soldiers contributed food and clothing from their own supplies, repaired water pumps, and used scrap lumber to make simple playground structures behind the main building. Reports and photographs from that period depict American and Korean hands working together, an image far removed from the battlefield that surrounded them. The Friendship Home was not an isolated case. Across the peninsula, military engineers participated in small, local reconstruction projects that grew out of necessity rather than formal policy. In Kunsan, where tens of thousands of refugees had crowded into temporary shelters, Army units helped rebuild sections of destroyed schools and install sanitation systems. Farther north, near Kunsan, U.S. servicemen assisted in the creation of the Zion Orphanage in 1953, providing building materials and transport. What began as impromptu acts of goodwill gradually developed into a pattern of organized support, often coordinated through chaplains, relief workers, and South Korean civic groups. The American military command recognized the importance of these efforts in maintaining morale among both troops and civilians. The United Nations Civil Assistance Command Korea UNCAC, established in 1951, began working closely with military engineers to channel surplus materials and labor toward civilian recovery. Engineers were uniquely positioned for this task. They possessed machinery, technical knowledge, and a disciplined workforce capable of constructing durable facilities under harsh conditions. Many battalion logs from late 1952 to mid-1953 contain references to rehabilitation assignments, including the rebuilding of schools in Taegu and the clearing of debris in Suwon. At the same time, Korean engineers and volunteers joined these efforts, learning new construction techniques and forming partnerships that would later influence the country's post-war rebuilding. Joint work details became common. American soldiers operated heavy equipment, while Korean carpenters and masons handled finishing tasks. In this cooperative rhythm, the war zone began to resemble the early foundations of reconstruction. The engineers' daily environment reflected both the devastation and the determination of a nation in transition. They operated in mud, cold, and unpredictability, yet found themselves increasingly drawn into civilian life. Near every base, there were displaced families, orphaned children, and towns trying to reestablish normal routines. It was in these liminal spaces, neither fully war nor fully peace, that the role of the engineer transformed. Their missions now carried two objectives: sustain the Army's movement and sustain the possibility of human recovery. The impact of these reconstruction efforts extended beyond immediate relief. They represented an early stage of what historians later called engineer diplomacy, the use of technical and humanitarian projects to bridge the gap between military presence and local population. Long before formal aid programs emerged, these soldiers and builders laid the groundwork for post-war cooperation between the United States and South Korea. When the armistice was finally signed in July 1953, the Friendship Home in Chongchonni and the Zion Orphanage in Kunsan stood not merely as shelters of children, but as symbols of how engineering, even in war, could become a language of peace. The catalyst of the engineers' humanitarian work had emerged years before the war's final months. In December 1950, as Chinese forces poured across the Yalu River and the United Nations Command ordered the evacuation of Seoul, a group of American chaplains, airmen, and South Korean volunteers carried out one of the most spontaneous and remarkable rescue efforts of the conflict. The operation became known as Operation Kitty Car, a name coined by the pilots themselves. With little more than improvisation and compassion, they evacuated nearly 1,000 Korean orphans and their caretakers from the approaching front lines to safety in the south. The mission began at Kimpo Air Base, where members of the 5th Air Force and several chaplains realized that the children of local orphanages were in imminent danger. There were no formal orders, no logistics plans, and no precedent for what they attempted. Pilots from transport squadrons diverted available aircraft, primarily C-54 Skymasters and C-45 47 Dakotas, to carry the children south to Jeju Island and other safe zones. The effort was chaotic and unrecorded in official combat logs, yet it marked one of the first large-scale humanitarian airlifts in the Korean War. Soldiers who participated later described it as a turning point in their understanding of duty. They were trained to move troops and equipment, but that day they moved lives. Operation Kitty Car became more than an isolated act of mercy. It established an emotional and moral framework that quietly influenced the conduct of many units in the years that followed. Within the U.S. military command, chaplains began to advocate for continued assistance to civilian populations, especially to the growing number of displaced children. Reports of the airlift circulated through Stars and Stripes and internal Army newsletters, highlighting that humanitarian action could coexist with military objectives. The success of the rescue revealed a powerful truth. Compassion could be organized with the same discipline as a combat mission. For the American engineers stationed in Korea, this precedent mattered deeply. As the front line stabilized in 1951 and 1952, their work shifted from constant movement to long-term construction. They built roads, bridges, and airstrips, but they also encountered the ruins of civilian life wherever they went. The story of Kitty Car lingered in the military consciousness, a reminder that soldiers could intervene not only to destroy or defend, but also to rebuild. Chaplains and unit commanders began encouraging participation in local relief efforts. When engineers repaired a schoolhouse or erected shelters, they did so with the understanding that these acts were part of a larger moral duty begun by their comrades in 1950. The ripple effect was visible across the peninsula. By mid-1952, several divisions had informal programs to support orphanages near their bases. The 2nd Infantry Division maintained its friendship home near Chongchonni, while units in Kunsan and Taegu sponsored similar institutions, often providing food, fuel, and basic maintenance. Engineering detachments, possessing both the skills and the equipment, became indispensable to these efforts. They transported lumber and metal from dismantled military structures, salvaged spare parts from depots, and converted them into roofs, fences, and eventually simple playgrounds. The psychological effect of this work was profound on both sides. For the Korean civilians, it demonstrated that the foreign troops occupying their land could act not as conquerors, but as partners in survival. For the American soldiers, it offered a sense of purpose beyond the abstract strategies of Cold War geopolitics. Many engineers, accustomed to precise blueprints and clear objectives, found a different kind of meaning in projects that were entirely improvised. A broken swing repaired, a roof patched, or a sandbox filled with gravel could represent a moral counterweight to months of destruction. The legacy of Operation Kitty Car thus became the moral blueprint for what followed. It had proven that compassion could move as efficiently as machinery, and that initiative did not always require authorization. When the engineers later chose to build playgrounds beside orphanages or repair shelters for displaced children, they were acting within that unspoken tradition. Their humanitarian work did not originate from policy. It grew from memory, from the image of pilots carrying frightened children onto aircraft at Kimpo, and from the realization that the war's most lasting victories might not be fought with weapons, but with acts of preservation. By the time 1953 arrived, that impulse had matured into a quiet, organized effort. The engineers had inherited not a formal order, but a legacy of example. Each bridge they repaired, each schoolyard they cleared, carried within it the echo of that first rescue, the moment when a military operation had transformed into an act of humanity, and the machinery of war had, for a brief instant, become an instrument of mercy. The process of construction began not with formal plans or blueprints, but with the quiet improvisation of men who had spent years turning metal and earth into instruments of war. The engineers who built the playgrounds and repaired orphanages worked with what was immediately available. Scrap wood from shipping crates, metal pipes left over from pipeline projects, empty fuel drums, and discarded rope from bridge sites. Nothing in these projects was issued through standard logistics channels. Every beam, every nail, and every bucket of gravel came from the margins of the supply system, scavenged or repurposed by soldiers who had learned that resourcefulness was often the difference between survival and success. Most of the work was done by hand. Heavy machinery that once leveled airfields was now used in a gentler way to clear debris, flatten the ground, or remove the remains of collapsed walls near orphanage buildings. The finer work, assembling swings, smoothing wooden planks, hammering together benches, was carried out with tools borrowed from field workshops. The soldiers did not see themselves as architects. They were builders in the most elemental sense. They used measuring tape and shovels instead of drafting tables, guided by intuition rather than schematics. The materials bore traces of their former use. Ammunition crates were split open and reshaped into benches or tables. Sections of steel pipe, once part of temporary bridges, became the main supports for swings. Communication cables, stripped and tied in loops, formed the ropes. The gravel used to reinforce roads was spread evenly across the play areas to create soft, stable ground. The colors of war, olive drab, gray, rusted metal, were painted over with white and blue, the only paint available in surplus stores. These hues were chosen not for aesthetic reasons, but because they represented neutrality, calm, and peace, tones that softened the brutal palette of the surrounding ruins. Local participation was essential. Korean carpenters and masons, many of whom had lost their own homes, joined the engineers. They brought knowledge of local materials and helped adjust the designs to the uneven terrain. Together, they built low fences to protect the children from nearby roads and drainage ditches. Nails were reused, hinges scavenged from abandoned warehouses, and roofs patched with sections of canvas cut from damaged tents. The collaboration blurred the boundary between occupier and native, soldier and civilian. Every nail driven into wood was a shared statement that something new could still be built out of what had been destroyed. In the mornings, the engineers worked under the same routines as any other mission. They lined up their equipment, divided into teams, and carried out their tasks with the same precision demanded in bridge building. But the atmosphere was different. The sense of urgency was not imposed by the threat of enemy fire, but by the quiet pressure of time, the knowledge that winter was coming and that the children needed a safe place to play before the cold returned. The soldiers treated the work as both duty and relief, a momentary escape from the monotony of repair yards and convoy schedules. Photographs taken by Army correspondents in 1952 and 1953 captured these scenes vividly. In one image, a group of engineers from the 2nd Infantry Division stood ankle-deep in mud, installing a swing set fashioned from iron tubing. In another, a Korean carpenter and an American sergeant painted a wooden seesaw with broad strokes of white paint. The captions and stars and stripes refer to them as engineers of peace, a phrase that quietly reframed the image of the soldier in the public imagination. Occasionally, South Korean Army engineers joined the efforts, providing manpower and tools. For them, the work carried a special meaning. Many had spent the war constructing fortifications or clearing mines. Building playgrounds offered a symbolic reversal of their trade. It was a form of reconciliation between nations, between soldiers, and between the past and what might come after it. When they stood together to finish a fence or secure a slide, the distinction between ally and local disappeared. What remained was the simple act of rebuilding. By the time each playground was completed, the result was modest but unmistakably transformative. The structure stood amid ruins like islands of calm. Rough as they were, they represented order in a landscape that had forgotten it. Every bolt, every joint, and every layer of paint bore the marks of improvisation and care. The soldiers knew the playgrounds might not last long. Wood would rot, metal would rust, but permanence was never the point. Their purpose was immediate and human. To remind a handful of children that safety and play were still possible, and to remind the men who built them that construction, even in the smallest form, could be an act of healing. When the first playgrounds were completed, their unveiling was quiet and uncertain. There were no ceremonies or official announcements. The engineers simply stepped back from their work, brushed the dust from their uniforms, and waited to see what would happen. Around the edges of the cleared lots, children gathered hesitantly, their eyes fixed on the strange new structures that rose from ruins. Many of them had never seen anything resembling a playground. The sight of American soldiers in uniform still carried fear. Uniforms had meant authority, danger, or displacement. For a moment, the space was suspended between two worlds, one of war and one trying to remember peace. The first interactions were tentative. Some of the youngest children stood in silence, holding the hands of older ones, too wary to approach. The engineers remained at a distance, pretending to check bolts and ropes, giving the children time to decide for themselves. Eventually, one or two stepped forward, touching the wooden beams or the painted swings. Laughter did not come immediately. It came in fragments, a short shout, a startled giggle when a swing moved, a race across the gravel as curiosity overcame fear. For soldiers who had spent years hearing only the rhythms of engines and gunfire, those small sounds felt like something sacred. Reports and photographs from the period confirmed the reality of these moments. In one documented scene at the Friendship Home near Chongchonni, engineers of the 2nd Infantry Division stood nearby as a group of Korean children began to play on equipment the soldiers had built days earlier. The children's clothes were tattered, their shoes mismatched, but their movements were free. Army correspondents later described the event as a rare day when the air was filled not with smoke, but with shouts of play. Similar scenes unfolded near Kunsan, where the newly founded Zion Orphanage received supplies and materials from American and Korean engineers. The opening of each space was an unspoken test of whether the war's emotional distance could be bridged. The soldiers quickly learned that the playgrounds required more than construction. They demanded care. Within days, the engineers organized what they called play days, unofficial gatherings when they brought simple gifts, rubber balls, jump ropes made from cable wire, makeshift baseball bats carved from wood. These items were scarce and often handmade, but to the children they represented an unimaginable luxury. On those afternoons, the gray military camps transformed into scenes of noise and movement. Soldiers tossed balls underhand to laughing groups, lifted children onto swings, or showed them how to climb the bars. The events lasted only an hour or two before duties called the engineers back to their posts, but they left behind a memory that lingered longer than rations or repairs. For the children, the soldiers ceased to be faceless figures in trucks. They became people who smiled, who built things that did not explode or command obedience. For the engineers, it was a reversal of habit. They were used to building for destruction's aftermath, roads through minefields, bridges for tanks, bunkers for defense. Here, their skills produced something that created rather than prevented life. The work was simple, but its meaning was immense. Letters preserved in regimental archives and personal diaries reveal that many men struggled to describe what they felt. One engineer wrote that hearing laughter near the barracks sounded like a new kind of engine starting. These first days also tested the durability of the structures. Heavy rains turned the grounds to mud, ropes snapped, and would warp under the humid Korean summer. Each failure brought the engineers back to repair what they had built. In doing so, they remained present, reinforcing both the structures and the relationships forming around them. Local carpenters began to help with maintenance, and Korean mothers occasionally appeared at the edges of the fields, watching silently as their children played. What began as a project of soldiers slowly became a shared community effort. Even the Army's correspondents, accustomed to reporting on battles and troop movements, began writing about these small sanctuaries. Articles in Stars and Stripes during 1952 and 1953 mentioned the playgrounds as symbols of recovery, describing the engineers as builders of hope. The stories circulated among units, encouraging others to undertake similar work. For a brief time, these acts of kindness became part of the unofficial rhythm of life behind the front lines. In the evenings, after the children returned to their dormitories, the engineers often lingered by the empty swings, watching them sway in the dusk. The smell of diesel and smoke still hung in the air, but now it mixed with something gentler, the scent of freshly cut wood and wet gravel. For men who had lived through years of chaos, the silence that followed playtime was unlike anything they had known. It was not the silence of fear or anticipation. It was a silence of peace beginning to return. For the first time in many months, the battlefield sounded human again. By the middle of 1953, the humanitarian work that had begun as scattered, spontaneous gestures had evolved into a structured and far-reaching system of care. What had once been informal acts of compassion by individual soldiers had become a coordinated effort across the entire United Nations command in Korea. The engineers' projects, playgrounds, orphanage repairs, and school reconstructions were no longer isolated occurrences, but part of a network of support that reached deep into the recovering South Korean countryside. The war was drawing to a close, but the social devastation it left behind demanded a new kind of military discipline, one focused on rebuilding. Official reports from the U.S. 8th Army and the United Nations Civil Assistance Command Korea UNCAC recorded that by early 1953, over 10,000 orphans were receiving direct assistance from American troops, and more than 53,000 were under continuing care through units of the UN forces. The number of orphanages receiving aid exceeded 400, stretching from Kunsan in the far south to Seoul, which was slowly being rebuilt after repeated bombardments. Engineering battalions played a crucial role in sustaining the system, not only by providing construction materials and manpower, but by using their logistical expertise to connect isolated orphanages with sources of food, clothing, and medicine. For the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and attached battalions such as the 84th, 62nd, and 802nd, the experience of the later war years turned into a form of civil engineering under fire. Their work expanded beyond bridges and runways to include repairs of schools, hospitals, and refugee housing. Trucks that once carried ammunition now delivered cement, lumber, and barrels of potable water. The engineers set up makeshift sawmills to cut planks for rebuilding projects, while others maintained generators that provided electricity to orphanages and clinics. Although these activities were technically outside their combat duties, they were quietly approved by division commanders who recognized their strategic and moral value. Photographic archives from the period show that the influence of these efforts extended far beyond immediate reconstruction. In images preserved by the U.S. Army Signal Corps and later published by Stars and Stripes, American and Korean children stand side by side with soldiers, painting fences, planting trees, or sweeping the grounds of orphanages. One well-known photograph taken near Chongchonni in 1953 depicts an engineer helping a child paint a wooden beam white, while other children line up with brushes. Another shows a group of soldiers repairing desks for a school near Taegu. These scenes were used not as propaganda, but as documentation of what one correspondent called the quiet front of peace. The spread of such activities also strengthened cooperation between American and South Korean military engineers. Joint projects became increasingly common, especially in the months leading up to the armistice. South Korean units contributed manpower and local knowledge, while American forces provided machinery and technical guidance. This collaboration marked one of the earliest examples of what historians would later identify as the foundation of the U.S. ROK engineering partnership that persisted long after the war. The Korean officers who took part in these programs went on to lead post-war reconstruction projects in the 1950s and 1960s, applying techniques first learned in those joint humanitarian missions. The influence reached even higher levels of command. Reports of the engineers' volunteer work circulated through the 8th Army headquarters in Seoul and were cited in morale briefings. Commanders noted that participation in orphanage and reconstruction projects reduced stress and strengthened camaraderie within the units. Soldiers who took part often described the work as the most meaningful part of their service. These sentiments filtered upward, shaping policies that encouraged continued humanitarian involvement by the U.S. military throughout the remainder of the war and into the occupation period. The cultural impact of the engineers' work also began to take root among the Korean population. Local newspapers and radio broadcasts reported on the efforts of foreign soldiers who helped rebuild schools and cared for children. For civilians who had lived under the shadow of occupation and warfare for decades, such stories represented a profound shift in perception. The image of the American soldier was no longer defined solely by weaponry and uniform, but also by the hammer, the saw, and the paintbrush. The soldier's actions became a living demonstration of how reconstruction could begin even before peace was officially declared. By the time the armistice was signed in July 1953, the network of orphanages and playgrounds sustained by American engineers had become one of the enduring symbols of post-war recovery. Many of the original structures did not survive long. The wooden beams rotted, the rope swings wore out, but their legacy remained visible in the relationships they built. Children who played on those makeshift swings grew up in a country that would soon begin its own era of rapid modernization, often remembering the soldiers who had first shown them what rebuilding looked like. The reach of these early humanitarian projects extended far beyond their physical boundaries. They planted the first seeds of what would become South Korea's vast reconstruction movement, where infrastructure and social recovery advanced side by side. In a war remembered for its stalemates and destruction, the engineers' playgrounds and orphanage repairs stood as small but undeniable victories, proof that even within the machinery of conflict, the capacity for empathy could not be erased. In the decades that followed the Korean War, most of the playgrounds and small structures built by American engineers disappeared from the landscape. The wood decayed, the paint faded, and the metal rusted away, absorbed by the country's rapid transformation. Yet the memory of those spaces endured, in photographs, in veterans' letters, and in the recollections of Koreans who had once been children in those orphanages. The legacy of these efforts became a quiet but persistent thread in the broader story of post-war reconstruction and the early relationship between South Korea and the United States. Archival photographs preserved in the National Museum of Korea, the War Memorial of Korea in Seoul, and the United States Army Center of Military History still capture fragments of those moments. In some images, children are seen climbing on rough wooden swings with the inscription, "Engineers Playground," painted in English and Hangul across the background. Others show soldiers kneeling beside freshly planted trees or mending fences at orphanages. These images, often taken by members of the U.S. Army Signal Corps between 1952 and 1953, became visual records of an unusual chapter in military history, a time when engineering tools served not only strategy but compassion. Historians later viewed these initiatives as early examples of what would become known as humanitarian engineering. They demonstrated how technical expertise, when combined with empathy, could play a crucial role in post-war recovery. In the 1950s, as South Korea began rebuilding its infrastructure with assistance from the United Nations and the U.S. aid programs, many of the principles first tested informally by military engineers reappeared in civilian projects. The cooperation between American and Korean builders during the war laid the groundwork for later partnerships under the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Korean Ministry of Construction. Some Korean engineers who had worked alongside U.S. units during the war would go on to lead key development initiatives in the 1960s, citing those wartime collaborations as their first training in modern engineering practices. For the American veterans who participated, the memory of those playgrounds and orphanages remained vivid long after their return home. Oral histories collected by organizations such as the Korean War Legacy Foundation and the Library of Congress include testimonies from engineers who describe the experience as the most meaningful aspect of their service. Many confess that those moments, hammering together makeshift swings, hearing children laugh amid the ruins, had shaped their understanding of what it meant to build. They had discovered that the purpose of their craft extended beyond combat logistics. It could be a form of moral reconstruction. In their recollections, the sound of laughter replaced the sound of artillery, a personal reminder that war could also give birth to acts of quiet mercy. Within Korea, the memory of these acts gradually blended into the country's broader narrative of survival and modernization. In local histories, especially in regions like Kunsan, Taegu, and Chongchonni, references still appear to foreign soldiers who helped repair orphanages or construct play spaces in the early 1950s. For many communities, these small gestures marked the beginning of post-war normalcy, a tangible sign that life could resume after devastation. Older residents who were children during the war sometimes recounted that their first memories of foreign soldiers were not of battles or occupation, but of swings, toys, and shared meals. The symbolic value of the engineers' humanitarian work also influenced how the American presence in Korea was remembered. At a time when foreign troops were often associated with destruction and control, the sight of soldiers painting fences and building playgrounds reshaped public perception. It offered a counterimage to the machinery of war, showing that power could manifest as generosity rather than force. For historians and sociologists, these gestures became an early case study in soft reconstruction, the use of human connection to stabilize post-conflict societies. Though no physical trace of the original engineers' playgrounds remains today, their legacy persists in memory and meaning. They stood for the belief that rebuilding a nation was not only a matter of steel and concrete, but of trust and compassion. Each photograph preserved in a museum or family album tells the same quiet truth, that amid ruin, the simplest acts of creation can endure longer than walls. For the engineers who built them, those playgrounds represented the moment when their profession transcended its military purpose. For the children who played there, they were proof that peace could take shape not as a treaty or speech, but as a swing moving gently in the wind. The story of the engineers who turned battlefields into playgrounds revealed a truth that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Korean peninsula. The end of a war was never truly marked by an armistice or a treaty, but by the gradual return of sounds that were once unthinkable. Children laughing, hammers building, trees rustling where explosions had once torn the air apart. Those sounds carried more meaning than any declaration of peace because they signified the return of ordinary life, the quiet rhythm that war had tried to erase. In those improvised playgrounds built by soldiers, the future of a wounded nation began to take its first breath. For the engineers, this transformation was more than a task. It was an awakening. They had arrived in Korea trained to measure progress in terms of logistics and tonnage, to think in lines of supply and tactical objectives. Yet the simple act of constructing a swing or repainting a broken gate redefined the purpose of their craft. They discovered that engineering could do more than sustain armies. It could restore faith. It could remind a devastated population and the men themselves that creation still had a place in a world built around destruction. Their tools, once used to fortify positions and repair machinery, became instruments of reconciliation. This quiet humanism was not written into military doctrine. It emerged instinctively from the collision of exhaustion and empathy. After years of destruction, the engineers understood that the most meaningful victory was not over an enemy, but over despair. Their labor did not end the war, but it challenged the idea that war could consume everything human. In rebuilding playgrounds, they rebuilt part of themselves. The precision and discipline that had defined their service were still present, but now they were directed towards something unmeasurable, the preservation of innocence. The philosophical weight of these small actions became clearer with time. Historians later recognized that such gestures of compassion were essential to how post-war societies healed. The engineers' work did not merely repair physical structures. It helped restore the emotional architecture of community. For a generation of Koreans who had known nothing but chaos, the sight of soldiers building spaces for play instead of fortifications disrupted the logic of conflict. It planted the idea that strength could express itself through kindness, and that the machinery of war could, even briefly, be turned toward the defense of life rather than its destruction. In a broader sense, these moments redefined what it meant to win. The engineers' achievements could not be recorded in battle reports or measured by territory gained, yet their impact endured longer than most military victories. The playgrounds they built were fragile, temporary, and easily forgotten by history, but their existence marked a moment when humanity began to reclaim the ground from war. Every swing and bench stood as a quiet monument to a different kind of courage, the courage to believe that rebuilding, however small, was still possible. For Korea, these acts represented the earliest sparks of recovery. They foreshadowed the nation's remarkable transformation in the decades that followed, when the same spirit of resilience and cooperation would rebuild cities, industries, and schools. The engineers' work embodied the idea that healing begins not with reconstruction on a grand scale, but with gestures that restore dignity to everyday life. The laughter of children on those first playgrounds echoed across years, carrying the faint but unmistakable sound of renewal. In the end, the story of the engineers was not about victory or defeat, but about continuity, the ability of human beings to create meaning in the aftermath of destruction. Their work proved that compassion could survive within the most mechanized systems of war, that discipline and mercy were not opposites, but reflections of the same human impulse. On that scarred land, the engineers built more than swings. They built a bridge between a world that had been lost and the one still waiting to be born. And perhaps, in that fleeting moment when laughter replaced gunfire, Korea began to heal, not through the signatures of generals, but through the hands of men who chose to build when everything around them had been built to break.